Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Always happy to have return engagements. Today we'll be rejoined by Celine Coggins, who is the CEO of the Goodness Web. We had Celine on about 2 years ago to talk about activating Gen X, and there's some interesting through lines to what she's doing today. Celine, welcome back to Trending in Education.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael.
It was interesting going back 2 years, which both seems like yesterday and seems like a lifetime ago. But you had a lot of interesting stuff going on. Folks who may not have heard that episode may not know your backstory. We'll include a link to it in the show notes. But for folks who don't know you, can you catch us up on who you are? And then maybe we can dig into what you've been doing around the Goodness Web.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am someone who's been 25 years or so on public education issues. I'm a social entrepreneur, founded my own organization, Teach Plus, and ran it for more than a decade. Ran an organization called Grant Makers for Education. The through line for both of those organizations is that I find individuals and connect them together to be a part of something larger than themselves.
Hmm.
I really believe in collective action, really believe in community. I've also taught at the Harvard Ed School. I have my doctorate in policy from Stanford and have recently become the CEO, the first CEO of an organization called the Goodness Web. So,
Hmm.
Goodness Web is a collective philanthropic fund focused on youth mental health. So,
Hmm.
we're a group of about 230 families who give on this issue, and we give to organizations that are poised to scale and make a transformative impact in the youth mental health space nationally.
Got it. So in some ways, it's similar to what you were doing at Grant Makers for Education, but now instead of education broadly, it's focusing on mental health and then specifically young folks' mental health.
Yes. So I, both at Grantmaker for Education and in this role, do the herding cats of, finding people who care about one issue
Yeah.
and figuring out how do we get to a place of alignment so
Hmm.
that we can bring large dollars to, a small number of nonprofits that really are doing great work instead of kind of distributing this little bit here and this little bit there. So we know that if you ask parents, the number one issue of concern for them is their young people's mental health,
Hmm.
but also only a little more than 1% of philanthropic giving happens in the youth mental health space. And at the same time, there's been this explosion of nonprofits in the space, many of them quite small, making for a complicated landscape for a
Hmm.
potential family that has the means to give. There are, at least 11,000 nonprofits in youth mental health. And so what we do is kind of curate, do that whole process of diligence to try to determine which are the ones who have a really incredible track record, which are the ones who are poised and have the team to scale.
Yeah. It's interesting doing all these conversations about education. I've been surprised how much mental health has been a recurring theme. In some ways, not surprised, but combination of, we talk about Jonathan Haidt's book, The
Yeah.
Anxious Generation, a lot. You and I talked a lot about generational zeitgeists and like what's going on with Gen X. And then coming out of the pandemic in particular, it does feel like there was a broader awakening around the mental health crisis that we're in the midst of. And then, the anxious generation and other work recently is talking about the impact of social media and really how we did damage to a rising generation. Can you expand on that? Because that sounds like sort of
Yeah.
central to what you got cooking
Yeah.
here.
Yes, definitely. So, I did some research on Gen X. This was a central issue for Gen Xers, the issue of mental health. It happens to be the case that the Goodness Web was founded by this incredible group of founders. So they had met together in grad school 25 years ago, came together again 25 years later and said, hey, this issue of youth mental health is one that has affected us all deeply and personally. We have the means, we have great connections. How do we create something catalytic in this space? And it's
Hmm.
not surprising that they all have kids of a certain age. I have kids of that same age. So my
Hmm.
youngest just turned 18 yesterday. I have a
Wow.
19-year-old, I have a 21-year-old. Same with all of the founders of the Goodness Web. And what I would say is, so Gen Xers, we all are. And what we have in common is the quintessential Gen X experience is saying, "Oh my gosh, the thing that I did in my childhood that I should be dead because of." So for me, it was at our park that I grew up in, cross the train tracks to go to the park and then play in the drainage ditch. Like there was a
Yeah.
4-foot drainage ditch, and those were the kinds of things that we all did.
Hmm.
So a decade ago, we all handed phones to our 11-year-olds for the first time and said, "Have at it."
Right.
It's this thing called Instagram. You'll share pictures of cats with your friends, and kind of willfully or not buried our heads in the sand around what could be, reasoning that, it couldn't be as bad as the things we were into in our childhoods, but
Right.
it was so, so much worse. And
Hmm.
so for those of us now who have young adults and are looking kind of out at our kids, at the kids in their orbit, for me, I've spent tons and tons of time in school. Seeing the rise of these issues is really, really just stops you in your tracks.
Yeah.
And I will kind of cite one of my favorite pieces of Jonathan Haidt's book, which really clicks things into place a lot for parents. So he talks about brain development at puberty, and he makes a real case for not allowing young people to have phones until after puberty, because puberty is a time not only of a ton of physical development, but also the neurons in your brain really kind of connecting and wiring. So he talks about how throughout history and time, most human brains as they develop look like, and I'm going to botch this, I'm not not a psychologist by training, but look like a lion's brain. So we are programmed to look for opportunity. Your brain is an opportunity seeking mechanism. Probably Gen Xers early in our careers, people were like, "Stay late at work, do more, here's something to do on the weekends," and we were like, "This is an opportunity, thank you."
Hmm.
But that was kind of the way our brains are wired. And because of the onslaught of like so much information coming at you through your phone nonstop,
Hmm.
young people's brains, especially who have access to social media in puberty, get wired to be like a mouse's brain. So threat
Hmm.
seeking. So I'm looking always scanning for threat in the environment. And so even for young people who don't have pronounced mental health issues, there's a fragility that
Hmm.
is kind of growing in this generation of kids that I think we should be worried about.
Yeah. It does tie also to the workplace. The other issue that I'm talking to folks about, particularly around human potential and, skills gaps and employment, is that in many ways, Gen Z is not really equipped with the skills and the mindsets and the ways of working to be able to plug right in and, make an impact and get on a good career path. I imagine
Yeah.
that is also connected to all of this.
I think so. And I think, we're now, call it 4 years out of COVID, but there are patterns that I think we need to think about. Did they get interrupted or not? And I think one of the great things about those of us who are Gen Xers, who are kind of leaders in the workplace now, is we say, we want to listen to youth voice. We want young people to have a say. We recognize that that's important, but sometimes that can tip over into, a cop out, basically. So if young people say, "Hey, path of least resistance is fully working remote from home,"
Hmm.
I would say you miss out on a lot of opportunities. Scott Galloway has a new book, and I've told my kids they should read it. It says basically, when you're in your 20s, you should only sleep, in your apartment. Otherwise, you should be out. You should be dating, you should be in a workplace, and you should be creating opportunities for yourself, because not for nothing, your Gen X bosses want to see you and want to see you raising your hands.
Right. And it does sound like, I made it this far without talking about AI. That's always my running gag on the show, but it always comes up because the other thing I've heard, big Scott Galloway fan as well, but the idea of internships and mentorship that was more readily available in previous generations is now harder, both because people are remote and also because you can, rather than give it to an intern, you can try to automate it away. And it's
Yes.
creating this experience gap where young people don't really get a chance to get those early experiences, those opportunities you're talking about,
Yeah.
and that can really slow down their growth and development throughout their lives.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a huge risk right now, especially as AI comes in. And it's incumbent on all of us to figure out how to use it to be more productive and efficient. And also, you know, I care a lot that my young people who I'm killing myself to pay for their college educations right now come out and are able to get jobs and
Right.
able to contribute. But the AI thing, I think, is a fascinating challenge. A decade ago, when I had young kids and we were handing them Instagram, you say, like, I don't want to be the Luddite. I don't, I want to be progressive. I care about them being technologically aware.
Yeah.
And now with AI, it's terrifying. So, did you see there was a story of a young person, a 14-year-old boy, who ended up committing suicide
Mm,
very recently? So, he had gone really deep in character AI.
mm,
And character AI, as of August, had 3.5 million unique users a day. So, you go on and you kind of live this live life with your favorite characters.
mhm.
Uh, and so he got really into Game of Thrones characters, fell in love with one of them, and they continued to say to each other, like, I want to come home to you. And, in the end, he killed himself. And
Wow. Yeah.
that's, I think, what we need to be aware of as
Mm,
we think about what are the right guardrails? How do we move faster to create some guardrails for young people in that kind of chatbot space? Because if you've never been in love before, but
mm.
that's the way that that starts to manifest itself for you for the first time, you know, that's going to be a challenging emotional experience that's really worrisome.
Yeah. It does feel like we're all living. I stopped watching Black Mirror because it was too much like my day to day, you know?
Yes, yes, yes.
But it does feel like, I guess putting it differently, we spent a little bit of time talking about the problem now, but, part of what you're doing at the Goodness Web is trying to figure out what types of solutions are in this space. And since you're connecting funders to a lot of this, grassroots venture activity that's out
Yeah,
there, are there certain types? How are you categorizing the types
yeah.
of activity that you see out there?
Yeah. So a couple of things. So first is, there's a lot of movement in the for-profit space. That's fantastic. I think they're good in, like where the for-profit space can fill in, fantastic.
Mhm.
Uh, we at the Goodness Web are going to stay squarely in the nonprofit space. We really kind of fund and think about three areas. So first, what I'll say is this comes from our donor community. So in my first few months on the job, have had conversations with all of our donors. The two things I hear the most, especially as it relates to kind of the emerging AI space, and
Yeah.
two is access to care. So oftentimes our donors will say, even as someone of means with a lot of education, with great connections, I had a problem with my own child and it was really, really difficult to access the care that they need. So those are a couple of drivers for us. We fund really in three areas. The first is prevention and early intervention, and that does have some overlap with schools, both
Mhm.
K-12 schools and colleges.
Yeah.
So we're looking to make sure that young people develop the skills that are going to head off emotional and psychological problems later down the line.
Mhm.
So that's one. A second area that we fund is in policy and coalition building. So we
Yeah.
recognize there are lots of opportunities to drive more government dollar to this issue to make sure that the regulations around mental health are in a place that are going to support the development of our young people. And then the last is people and access to care and trying to figure out how do you grow that space. Just like in the teacher workforce, we have a shortage in the behavioral health workforce, and that
Mm.
happens at lots of different levels. And so that's really where we're focused on our funding.
That makes sense. And then you mentioned, the educational angle where a lot of our listeners are, interested in that.
Yeah.
Are there new models emerging around how to staff schools or how to kind of
Yeah.
position mental health well-being as foundational to what schools are supposed to do?
Yes. So there are both new things and then lots of the old. So I would start by saying the universal challenges of schools haven't changed. So I note three. One is we can't load teachers with one other thing. Teachers are super overburdened. We know that teacher morale is kind of always waning, over the past decade. We have to figure out how to support our teachers. Number two, there are no shortage of good ideas in schools that get implemented as a pilot somewhere, and the principal really cares about it, and the teachers really care about it, and it goes well.
Yeah.
Then we try to scale it to other places, and that's a challenge.
Hmm.
And the third kind of universal of schools is there's never enough money. So we have to work within that landscape.
Yeah.
At the same time, there really are some good things happening, both in terms of, the social and emotional learning space has, really kind of had the opportunity to grow, refine itself, get additional funding.
Withstand a bit of a backlash too, frankly, which was
Yeah, yes,
surprising,
yes,
you know?
yes, yes. I think that's totally fair, and I think that, yes, there are some states where you can't say social and emotional learning anymore, but you can say character education, you can say
Right.
value education, you can say, how do people develop the roots of emotional resiliency?
Hmm. Hmm.
So kind of language issues aside, I think that we have done some learning about what young people need.
Yeah.
The thing that I'll say is we have started to look at, for example, across all states, there's an organization called Inseparable that we fund that does amazing work in the policy space. And they audited, like what are the ratios in every school across the country of students to mental health workers in any capacity. And
Right.
so starting to kind of drive a conversation that is data driven around, what is a good model? What are good ratios in schools is important.
Hmm.
And then there are emerging models around like AmeriCorps is now moving into the behavioral health space and saying, okay, so we bring tons and tons and tons of young people near peers with some training into schools. Maybe we can be the first line of defense in behavioral health support. So the first person someone talks to. Now, you're not a trained therapist. Some young people will get referred to trained therapists, but there are some models like that that are exciting. And then also the expansion of schools being able to be reimbursed for the services they provide with Medicaid dollars. That's another way to make sure that the dollars that are needed are getting into schools so that young people can get the services right there where they are. Because
Yeah.
we're not going to solve this problem by staying out of schools. Schools are where kids are every day.
Yeah. It's interesting too. You're talking a lot about themes around the future of work as well. I've heard Anish Raman from LinkedIn has talked about how we're moving from pedigree and credential economy to more of a relationship economy where
Yeah.
people actually need these interpersonal skills, and especially as AI gets better and some of the automation really makes it out, in meaningful ways, the human element will be more front and center, the durable skills that you need, but then even the nature of jobs. Are there any forecasts about the future job prospects for folks who get involved in mental health? Because there's got to be huge upside there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a set of skills that, K-12 schools need to help young people develop,
Mhm.
especially kind of coming out of COVID because we have some gaps.
Yeah.
So, emotional regulation, the ability to deal with frustration, the ability to kind of navigate conflict. So, this is where it gets so worrisome when you think about, young people having access to chatbots because
Right.
I'm in middle school. I had a fight with all of my girlfriends. I turned to my AI companion, and it's easier to just stick with this kind of universally positive conversation with my AI companion than it
Right.
is to go back and have really difficult conversations with humans who are probably 50% of the problem and I'm 50% of the problem. So that set of skills is really important. Schools are, a place where you have to develop those skills.
Hmm. Yeah. And it does remind me of the education, learning science ideas around productive struggle and desirable difficulty,
Yeah,
where social media was sort of the first generation of this, where basically everything was available in an app in your pocket.
yeah,
So, you didn't really have to struggle too much. Stuff didn't,
yeah,
Gen X, we had to deal with boredom and
yeah,
a lack of things to do. And then you add to this, this next wave of artificial intelligence coming in, it's going to be a lot easier to just kind of stay in your bubble and
yeah.
kind of be protected. You mentioned policy as it relates to this and kind of
Mhm,
learning lessons from the previous generation of social media.
mhm.
I'd love to get some of your thoughts on that. Where like I'm concerned that we're still kind of diagnosing the problem from the last generation, and now
Yeah,
this next generation it's going to compound the problem in a lot of ways. It's going to potentially make things worse. So,
Yeah.
how do we get out ahead of that? How do we think about this on the policy side?
Yes, yes. Well, I think there are some states, red and blue, that are kind of doing a good job of getting ahead of this. And again, I want to say red and blue because I do think that this one transcends.
Hmm.
And so, so that's one area. Then the Kids Online Safety Act. I think there are things at the federal government that have some good potential. But I also think, to your point about productive struggle, I think the adults, full on adults, need to lead a better conversation sometimes around things like anxiety.
Hmm.
So I have, some my own kids, and they talk about anxiety as if it's something to eliminate, right?
Hmm.
So we don't want to go there. We want to say, hey, if you have a big test and you haven't studied, it's natural for you to have anxiety. That's your body telling you time to study, focus.
Right. Right.
And we need that. And so, I think that we can't abdicate those basic conversations either as we think about, how do you raise this generation of kids who is
Mm.
very sensitive to anxiety, very quick to label things traumatic or triggering. There's a meeting in the middle between those of us who can recognize all the trauma we went through for decades,
Right. Right.
and those who
Yeah.
are very attuned to everything as potential trauma.
Yeah, as an old dad with a 5-year-old, I resist the urge to, start saying, suck it up and just deal with it. But there is an element of that being kind of healthy. And, what about educating parents and like understanding how to reach something I know you've thought a lot about is how do
Yeah,
we reach Gen X and how do we reach folks who maybe are kind of not overly motivated, not overly
yeah,
activated, but realizing they're actually playing a role in both creating and sustaining this problem, but also potentially working our way out of it. How are you thinking about reaching parents and
yeah.
helping equip them to deal with some pretty complex stuff?
Yeah. So I'll give two answers. First is we fund a program called Think Kids. And so it's a methodology. Basically, at the end of your annual pediatric visit with your young person, here now have a conversation with a behavioral health specialist, and they can give you access to a training that allows you to work with your child to develop the things that are going to head off problems down the line. So,
Mm.
how do you deal with frustration? How do you build resilience around challenges? And
Mhm.
so, common language between parent and adult, engaging the child in helping to solve the problem. And
Mhm.
so, that's one thing I think that, if we take every well visit, your annual physical checkup, and say, let's talk about mental health and let's give you some tools as a parent to do better by your kid,
Mm.
that's great.
Mhm.
Second, I'll say I just had the opportunity to interview Dr. Vivek Murthy, the US Surgeon General,
Yeah.
and he did an amazing job talking about, we all as humans, he has identified and done a Surgeon General's warning on the crisis of loneliness and isolation.
Mhm.
That really transcends generations, though young people report the highest levels of loneliness.
Yeah.
So, what he said, and I might botch this, but I thought it was so profound, is we all need to be in the business of actively combating loneliness. And some of the social structures that existed pre COVID, need to be rebuilt. We need to build things in place of or alongside. Many of us have kind of maybe started out participating in organized religion, good reasons why maybe that's not the right mechanism now, but we still need entities that connect us. So he said basically, we need to be connected around three things, and we need kind of organizing mechanisms for these. One is community. Humans need community. Two is meaning. And
Mm.
third is service to others.
Mhm.
So in my mind, I was sitting there and he was talking to people who are part of the goodness web. And I was like, this is what we're trying to do in the goodness web. It is that it's community, it's meaning, and it's service to others.
Yeah. It does remind me, I think I mentioned Eric Erickson in our last conversation. The crisis for midlife is
Oh,
generativity versus stagnation. It's different earlier in like identity formation, and there's a lot of other stuff that has to happen earlier. As someone who's really grappled with this Do you have any messages, any advice you might be able to share with our Gen X listeners and others? But
Yeah.
Gen X gets forgotten a lot. So I want to make sure someone who thinks about it a lot, what advice would you give to Gen X folks?
Yeah. Well, so I went through, so it was 2 years ago, I was 1 year from turning 50.
Hmm.
Now I'm 1 year past turning 50. I had a really, I think, productive and data-driven midlife crisis. So, I'm teaching at Harvard. I had a group of students mutiny and basically say, "We blame your generation for all the problems of the world." Now,
Hmm.
mostly I would have had like a cynical take on that, but it just so happened that there were a lot of things going on in the world in my life that made me stop and think. And so I basically ran out and said, I'm a trained researcher. I'm going to do a study. I did like a study of a survey with 800 people and then interviewed 100. And there were lots of issues that came up, but the one that rose in a way that was surprising to me on the survey was our generation's interest in mental health. And then when I did the interviews, just opened up this treasure trove of conversation about I never went to therapy until I was over 40 and it changed my life. My kids and social media and, legalized marijuana, legalized gambling, and so many
Hmm.
different things that are coming at them. And how do
Yeah.
I navigate that? And so when the opportunity at the Goodness Web came up, I was like, oh my gosh, it's a group of Gen Xers who are working on the thing that I actually know matters to tons of us.
Yeah.
Kind of this mental health crisis among young people happened on our watch and under our noses, and we really want to do something about it. And so for me, I would say it was a really productive thing to have my midlife sense of land on this side. And then I'll say the most interesting and useful article I read along the way it was in the Harvard Business Review. And it basically said, you can reinvent yourself, but only within bounds. And I was like, that's exactly right. I've worked on youth issues for my whole life. I worked on policy for my whole life. I worked on community building for my whole life. But also now I'm in this place where I have to learn more about behavioral health and learn more about the clinical side. And I love that. I feel super challenged. I'm working harder than I ever have. And frankly, I think that's being a good role model to my kids who are, kind of getting close to coming out of college now and
Hmm.
thinking about careers. And you can reinvent yourself over time. You can do new things. And yeah, I
Yeah.
like
But just within those boundaries, you know what I mean? Like,
within some bounds. I mean, there
yeah.
were definitely days where I was like, I don't know, should I join the circus? So I landed where I was supposed to land.
Yeah. Well, and you touched on the polarization. We're recording this right in advance of a big election that's
Yes.
coming. That is another context that is driving some of the anxiety and is driving some of the discord that
Yeah.
we're all living with nowadays. Thoughts on that? One takeaway I have from what you're describing here is that mental health really should be nonpartisan. And I
Yeah.
think there perhaps is a trend that we have to push to
Yeah.
continue to make it that. But I'd love to get a little bit of your perspective on, just the fractured political landscape that we're dealing with in the US.
Yeah. I mean, right now I'm working with a group of pragmatists who would say, this is the issue of our time. This is the one that we should be working on behalf of the young people we care about and love and the generation behind them.
Hmm.
And so I think we are kind of relentlessly focused on keeping it a nonpartisan issue, keeping it a bipartisan issue, thinking carefully about language and things like that so that we're inviting lots of people in and making it a big tent. And just kind
Hmm.
of coming back to where I started. Every parent says this is their number one issue of concern is their kids'
Hmm.
mental health.
Yeah.
And so if that's where we are right now, we need to figure out how do you engage those people so that we really drive change in this moment.
Hmm. I'm talking with Celine Coggins, who's the CEO of the Goodness Web. It's been a really amazing conversation. I am the parent of a 5-year-old, so I have to ask one question there.
Yeah.
As someone who's raised Gen Z, they're calling it Gen Alpha generation,
Alpha.
which is
Yeah.
just so bad. We need language around. Maybe I need to follow up with you about starting a movement for a new name for that
Oh my
generation.
gosh. Right. Yes.
But all that aside, it sounds like there's some lessons learned from parents who have raised Gen Z. What advice might you give for parents of younger kids, based on your experience and what you're learning in your role?
Yeah, so it's interesting. My youngest is applying to college now. And so lots of her friends are the first in their family to go to college. And people say to me, like, what advice do you have? And I'm like, it's an inscrutable process. Like, I have no advice. And in some ways, I would say the same. You know, what's interesting to me is that I think we have to live with the notion that there's always going to be somewhat of a generation gap and still do our part to lean into kind of our adult responsibility.
Mhm.
So, one of the things that was depressing for me, but it made sense once I saw it, was there was a recent study that asked parents and kids. So, it asked parents, are you emotionally available to your child? And so I would say, so much more than like I got when I was growing up. And so many of us would say that. And so about 87% of parents, I think, said, yes, I'm very emotionally available to my child. When you ask the children, only about 27% said it. And so I think we have to live in the world where, we have a lot of influence on our kids. And also they're going to see us and say, I see your flaws too. I see
Yeah.
the ways in which you're a hypocrite. And, and so it's never going to be perfect. And,
Yeah.
but you get lots of days to get up to bat again.
Yeah. Perfect is the enemy of the good, I guess. And
Yeah.
then, maybe as we conclude here, you talked a little bit about artificial intelligence. That's one of the topics that probably pops the most. I'm
Yeah.
almost tired of talking about it, but it keeps changing, so it keeps
Yeah.
getting interesting. Do you see anything coming maybe on the positive side? I've been toying with the idea of trying to write screenplays for the opposite of a Black Mirror, but are there ways in which technology, AI, and otherwise might
Yeah.
actually help
Yeah.
address some of this? I mean, Headspace and Calm are some examples of this,
Yeah.
but how do you think
Well, there
technology?
are apps now. There's one, I'm not going to plug it because we're researching it. It's not a grantee yet, but what they've done is partnered with TikTok and I think Snapchat to recognize when a young person is using language related to, say, self harm.
Mm,
And it pops in and gives them the appropriate crisis line to call, the opportunity to do one like therapy session and other resources that they can use. And so, in the world where TikTok and Snapchat and all of those exist, there are things like that that I think can really help to, make sure that what's happening online doesn't just stay in a private vacuum.
mhm. And I guess, the platforms themselves have to recognize the problem
Yeah.
and own how they may be able to contribute to better outcomes. Do you
Yeah.
see that recognition and that awareness out there?
Nope. No, I do not. I do
Yeah.
not. And I think the things that they do, like Instagram, kind of doing the now you have to be this age to sign in. Every
Mhm.
kid knows how to get around those things. And
Mhm.
very few parents have the wherewithal to just go back in. I remember this with my kids when they were 12 and 13 and 14 every night to try to like scour what have you removed from your phone that was on there all day and what like Finsta account do you like it's just, and so it can't be left to the parents, but I don't think that the social media companies are good-hearted and the things that they're doing are meant to do anything except distract from like fundamentally we need shifts.
Yeah. And then I guess, Jonathan Haidt, and perhaps you feel similarly, like just be more thoughtful about putting the phones away and limiting access to these things. Is that like a higher
I
level?
mean, yeah, you do see when I talk to parents of younger kids, the idea like wait until it seems really to have taken off. So
Mm,
I gave my kids phones the day they hit sixth grade, even before. That
mm,
was the norm then. Those norms are getting pushed out. So that's a great thing. Phones in schools, it has been a very quick evolution from everybody had their phone to your phone goes away either in a pocket by class or all day. Those are really important things, and those are changing really rapidly, and so I think that's awesome.
yeah. And if folks want to learn more about the goodness
Yeah,
web, it's the goodness web.
goodnessweb.org, yes.
.org. Hopefully we pique people's interest.
Yeah.
As we wrap up here, Celine, any parting thoughts, any takeaways as we conclude?
I would just say, as a parent who just went through this college application process, my heart is with all of the parents who are trying to get that done over the next couple of days. Our kids do have real stress and real strain that is outside of this social media world. And so good luck to all of those parents. And Michael, just thank you to you for having me on. This was super fun.
Amazing stuff. Celine Coggins is the CEO of The Goodness Web, thegoodnessweb.org, if you want to learn more. Thanks again for appearing, and thanks to our listeners for listening. If you like what you're hearing, please subscribe, tell your friends, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.